朋友们，大家都知道中国的电动汽车非常有竞争力，但是大家可能并不清楚西方国家汽车品牌的高层究竟是怎么看待中国电动汽车的。这一期我们聊聊这个话题。根据美国科技媒体的报道，在10月21日播出的一档播客节目中，美国第二大汽车生产商福特公司首席执行官，也就是 CEO 吉姆法利透露自己过去半年来一直都在驾驶小米电动汽车，并且根本不想换车。吉姆在节目中大谈小米汽车，他说这太棒了，他们每月卖出1万到2万辆，6个月内就销售一空。他在节目中谈到小米初期的成功时说，你知道这是一个行业巨头，也是一个比汽车公司强大得多的消费品牌。我不太喜欢谈论竞争，但我开的是小米。我从上海往芝加哥空运了一辆，我现在已经开了6个月了，而且我根本不想换车。跟吉姆法利对话的主持人罗伯特也提到了，今年他去澳大利亚探亲时，发现2个亲戚都换了比亚迪。吉姆神情严峻地补充道，在澳大利亚的燃油车市场也是这样的，那里卖的最好的 SUV 不是丰田或者福特，而是长城、哈佛汽车。2023年初，吉姆首次访问中国，当时他和 CFO 约翰劳勒体验了一把合作伙伴长安汽车的电动 SUV。2个人在测试跑道上全力测试后，沉默不语地坐在了一起。对于福特而言，现在经常讨论的话题就是如何与中国车企竞争，然后活下来。总之这一位 CEO 对于中国电动汽车的看法非常的有趣。我把这一段翻译后的采访放上来，朋友们可以认真看一看，你会发现中国电动车的强大究竟把这些西方汽车的老板震惊到了什么程度。
70% of all electric cars made on the globe are made in one country, China.
Yeah. Wow. It is 70%. I didn't realize that.
70%.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow.
And then that market is starting to specialize, where they have electric vehicles for long range travel, where the charging structure is not built out, called an EREV. It goes 150 to 200 miles all electric. It's an electric car. And it has a small industrial combustion engine that powers the batteries, and that could power on one tank of gas up to 1,000 to 1,200 kilometers.
Right.
But it drives as an electric car. There's no transmission, there's no axles or differentials. It's a pure electric vehicle with a backup system in case you can't find charging.
Yeah.
And in China, it's the fastest growing subsegment of the EV industry.
Right.
And now you have the geopolitics and the labor and everything connected to these second order issues with electric taking off and having the Chinese be so dominant around the globe in terms of cost. And they see Europe and the UK and many markets around the globe as opportunistic. And that is totally changing the global supply chain footprint. Yeah. It's changing brand preferences. It's changing jobs. It's going to transform our industry. And in the last year, that's come into focus.
Right. Yes, I think so. I think everyone's aware of that. I mean, I just wanted to say that when I last was in Australia earlier this year, my sister-in-law and my niece, who are two people who you couldn't find anyone with less interest in cars, except they drive them, because they use them. They've both got BYDs.
There you go.
That was not, and you'd sort of think, oh, well, that's because they've talked to you, Robert. I never mentioned anything about it because there's no point talking to them about cars. They're not interested. Yeah. So I keep, they are so common there already. I mean, that explosion of their uptake is extraordinary in Australia.
And it's included in the combustion world. I think the best-selling SUV in Australia, which is a very important market, as you mentioned, because it's completely open.
Yeah.
And yet people drive like Western Europe or even in the US and places. So it's a very important market. I watch it very closely.
Yeah.
Maybe more than Norway these days. And also the best-selling SUV there is no longer Toyota or Ford. It's Haval, and it's a Chinese brand.
Yeah.
So things are changing. Mexico, 25% of all sales in Mexico, which it'd be a long drive, but I could get there in one day from where we're doing this interview. And that's 1 out of 4 vehicles sold in Mexico is built in China.
It's built in China. And these are not all electric, but a lot of them will be.
No, yeah, you're right. Half are not.
Right.
But, you know, it just happens in our industry. It happened with the Model T. You know, when a new technology comes, there's a fitness test for costs. And whoever has the lowest cost, like Henry Ford with the Model T, you know, they tend to have the opportunity to sell into higher cost markets like Europe or Britain or Mexico or Australia. And that cost advantage is very material for the customer. It could be 25% savings. Yeah. And in the world of tough choices, where your car is the second most expensive thing you buy, a lot of customers are like, I'm willing to take a risk. And, you know, Chinese manufacturing has really been proven to so many consumers in so many consumer product categories as being fully superior quality in many cases, in many categories. So it's not like the risk that some people would imagine even 5 years ago. So it's for being the head of Ford, this is the topic that we discussed the most in the last year. How do we compete? Where do we want to compete? How do we win? What rights do we have to win? What capabilities do we have to build in the company to compete and survive?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, in a way, because I've sometimes referred to previous, you know, expansions of automotive manufacturing around the world from different countries. So like Japan, Korea, other Asian countries that made a big impact on the American market. I'm talking particularly about America. You know, Toyota in the kind of early 1960s was a tiny company that made not particularly attractive cars. Well, they became massively successful. But what I feel is the Chinese, what's happening in China and the Chinese car manufacturing is kind of an order of magnitude different, because Japan is essentially quite a small country.
It is. You're absolutely right. Let's look at the numbers. The global new automotive market is 90 million units.
Right. So that's what's manufactured each year is around 90 million units. Right.
90 million. And Japan is between 4 and 5 million. So that's not even 5% of the global.
Yeah.
You add Korea in there, it's even smaller market. China is 1/3. It's 30 million vehicles. It's twice the size of Europe and the UK combined.
Wow.
And they have 58 million units of capacity built out already. So they can export 28 or 29 million vehicles. And that is larger than the Europe, all of the UK, and most of Mexico, part of the US, and all the companies wouldn't have to build one vehicle, and they don't have to build any more factories. That's the factories they have today.
Right, right. That is huge, isn't it? Yeah. That is extraordinary. And I mean, what I think is, because you will have been aware of that for 20 years of that happening, but I think the general public have gone, where do all these Chinese cars come from? You know, and then you know, and I always go on, well, look, your phone, the router in your house, the cabling, the little clips that they're on there, they're all made in China, as is your hat, your trousers, your shirt, you know, everything it's like that.
Well, I think people maybe not realize this, but I hope they do. China made this commitment more than a decade ago.
Yeah.
Far before any of the Western countries fell in love with pure electrification.
Yeah.
And companies like BYD, they were very small when they started their journey. They're now much bigger than Tesla, the biggest in the world, as you mentioned. Yeah. And you know, they've been on this journey for 15 years. CATL, the biggest battery company in the world that makes batteries for your iPhone and most of the devices you mentioned, they're the largest battery company in the world. They were founded more than two decades ago. And Robin, who found that, he's the largest battery maker. We're starting to make his batteries here in Michigan. And we'll be the first one with LFP chemistry in the U.S. But, you know, they have IP that the rest of the world has not developed. It's not the old days where, you know, someone would copy a Western technology. The opposite is true. When it comes to battery tech and the size of the market and the government's support for the companies, and the enduring investment for 10 years plus to be a leader in the IP like battery tech and the whole raw material of batteries, plus all the processing of the raw materials that happens in the country, that is a dominant move that happened a decade ago, and now everyone's seeing it on the street in front of their house. But it didn't happen overnight. The market was big enough for the last 6 or 7 years where none of those companies needed to export. And then it wasn't big enough. And then everyone started to notice. But for a company like Ford, this is something we have been watching for a while, but I've had 2 trips to China in the last 2 years that were literally epiphanies, where I walked away. The last one was about the Xiaomi product, because in the West, our cell phone companies are not into they don't have car companies. But in China, both Huawei and Xiaomi, the 2 biggest cell phone companies, are inside of every vehicle that is made. In fact, Xiaomi, the Apple, you could argue the Apple of China, they actually make their own car, the whole car. And now it's one of the best-selling cars in China.
No, it is amazing. When you think of the sort of amount of our media attention and discussion and hypothesizing about the Apple car, which we never
twice as big. The market is more than twice as big in total, and the electric part of the China market compared to the U.S. or Western Europe is like 20 times bigger. So you're exactly what you said. It's like everyone's talking about the Apple car, but the Xiaomi car,
which now exists and is on the road,
which now exists,
tens of thousands,
and it's fantastic. They sell 10,000, 20,000 a month. They're sold out for 6 months.
Wow.
That is an industry juggernaut and a consumer brand that is much stronger than car companies. I don't like talking about the competition so much, but I drive the Xiaomi. We flew one from Shanghai to Chicago, and I've been driving it for 6 months now, and I don't want to give it up.
Right. Wow. That's an extraordinary thing to say, isn't it? I mean, I totally understand it. I mean, I think it's great that you do, in that sense that you're experiencing what, you're not saying, because I do remember seeing a load of BYD cars at the Geneva Motor Show, and I think about 2009. And I thought, these are not good. They're not well made. They looked weird. They just didn't look right. But my goodness, now you look at what they're doing. Anyway, we don't have to talk about anymore.
I'm fine too, because I think this was all something that we processed as a team, and we were not naive to. And we did look the other way. And why is that the case? Well, I worked at Toyota for 25 years. When I joined Toyota in the U.S., there was 500 people at the company.
Wow.
And we were like a marginal brand. No one even knew of us, as you said, outside of Kick. I worked there for 20 years.
Right.
My family was not happy. They wouldn't talk to me here in Detroit because they were ashamed that I worked there. And there was a huge social cost in the Midwest of the U.S. for the success of Toyota. So many jobs were lost, including many people in my family. And, I can't unlearn that as a young man. I can't unlearn the fact that the Detroit 3 really never had a plan. And we're not going to miss this one. Bill Ford and I shook hands, or embraced, whatever metaphor you want to use. And we said, this one, we're going to have to get it right from scratch. And that's why we created the Skunk Works team in California, because I felt like the institution of Ford would have a really tough time competing with BYD. So we needed a ground up team with a similar approach as Kelly Johnson's SR-71, Skunk Works in California. My badge doesn't even work there. I can't even get in the building.
Wow.
And that,
seriously? Wow.
Oh yeah, no. And that's how extreme of a different approach we needed to compete against BYD, because the traditional industrial company, look at you know, VW with MEB and so
Yeah.
many other companies in the West that tried to compete in China and now are just adopting Chinese platforms because they couldn't do it. We all saw that coming, and so we said we got to take a different approach.